the Obsidian Swarm ambassador, a creature of pure conquest, dropped his ceremonial blade and began to tremble, his multifaceted eyes fixed on the quiet human standing in the corner. "You," the ambassador hissed, his chitinous plates clicking in a sudden frantic rhythm of terror. "Do you want to know what ghosts look like when they finally step into the light? Subscribe to this chronicle and witness the moments that change the galaxy forever. Now let us look at how a god of death ended up in a princess's drawing room." 6 hours earlier, the High Sovereign's heavy silk robes had swished against the marble floor, a sound Lyra usually found comforting, but today felt like a shroud. Lyra stood by the tall, crystalline windows of the Aethelgard spire, watching the arrival of the man her father called a border security solution, a celestial princess sold to a ghost in a gardener's skin. That was how the court gossips were already framing it. When the shuttle door hissed open, she didn't see an army. She didn't even see a soldier. Silas Thorne stepped onto the landing pad carrying nothing but a worn canvas satchel. The strap was frayed, the fabric stained with what looked like common soil. His hair was the color of a winter moon, and he walked with a slight, heavy-lidded exhaustion that made the Golden Guards smirk behind their visors. "Is this the primitive who will hold our line?" her father whispered, his voice dripping with the effortless disdain of the immortal. Lyra didn't answer. She was watching Silas's eyes. They didn't marvel at the floating spires or the sun's light trapped in the architecture. Instead, they catalogued every exit, every guard's grip on their spear, and every shadow in the hall. He looked less like a guest, and more like a man who had already decided how he would kill everyone in the room if he had to. If you're finding yourself drawn to the secrets hidden in the quietest souls, subscribe to follow the rest of Silas's journey. When they were finally introduced, the court's mockery was thick enough to choke on. The High Sovereign made a show of explaining the complexities of the Obsidian Swarm's recent incursions, speaking slowly as if to a child. Silas just stood there, his hand resting loosely on the strap of that battered satchel. He looked like he just wanted to watch his tomatoes grow. Yet the most dangerous man in the galaxy didn't need to speak to command the air around him. Lyra felt a chill. The meek human wasn't listening to the politics. He was smelling the air, sensing a predator long before the alarms ever chimed. The ambassador's knees hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud. The swarm creatures in the balcony hissed in terror, retreating into the darkness as Silas took a single step forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted the strap of the canvas bag on his shoulder. 30 years of silence ended with a single whispered name. Silas said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to vibrate the very crystals in the walls. The ambassador's mandibles clicked frantically. "The Butcher of Centauri," he choked out, the words a death rattle. "They said you were dead. They said you were burned with the rest of them." Lyra watched her father, the High Sovereign, go pale. The man he had mocked as a meek primitive was currently paralyzing the most feared conquerors in the quadrant just by existing. Silas didn't look like a butcher. He looked like a man who had seen too much blood and decided he preferred the smell of rain on soil. "I was dead," Silas replied, his eyes never leaving the ambassador. "Then you followed me here. You're treading on my garden, Vol, and I'm very protective of my growth." The ambassador didn't wait for a second warning. He scrambled backward, his guards dragging him toward the exit in a panicked blur of limbs and clicking armor. The obsidian swarm that had threatened to swallow Aethelgard whole vanished into the corridors like smoke in a gale. Silence returned to the hall, heavier than the tension that had preceded it. Silas turned to Lyra. The hypervigilance was still there, but the deep, bone-weary exhaustion seemed to settle back into his shoulders. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, sun-dried seed. "The treaty is signed," he said quietly to her father, though his gaze remained on Lyra. "They won't come back, not while they think the shadow is still standing in the corner." He walked past the stunned guards and the trembling sovereign, heading toward the garden terrace. Lyra followed him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found him kneeling in the dirt of the royal flower beds, digging a small hole with his bare fingers. "You really just want to grow things, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas didn't look up, but his hands slowed. "I spent a lifetime taking. I'd like to spend what's left of it seeing if something can actually survive because of me." He placed the seed in the earth and covered it with the care of a man handling a glass heart. The feared god of death stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, looking once more like nothing more than a weary traveler. The worn canvas satchel sat on the marble bench beside him, once a symbol of his lowly status. It now sat open, revealing not weapons but packets of seeds and a single dented canteen. It was no longer a sign of poverty, but a sacred vessel of his penance. Silas looked out at the three suns setting over the spires, his hand hovering over the dirt he had just turned.